Hey, I'm Rose,
And I'm Angie.
and this is Our Lives with Bots, the show where we ask important, timely questions about what it means to live with our bot counterparts. And from time to time, we also dive deep into what an AI future might look like for us.
Sometimes we agree, sometimes we spiral, but we always go deep.
So, with the depth today, congratulations, you've made it through series 1 of our podcast on companion chatbots, and welcome to series 2. So, Angie, what is series 2? What are we going to talk about?
Series 2, we are going to go deep into AI and the impact on youth and children. This is a really, really serious topic. So, we're going to cover a lot of variety within this topic. We're going to cover different perspectives. We're going to talk about different stakeholders, different risks, different implications. And we're going to do a lot of that today in terms of laying the foundations for it. And then, as we've done with our previous series, we're going to go into more depth with that in terms of telling you more about some news articles and some research articles. And then, as always, we're going to welcome some guest speakers. But we have something up our sleeve before we get started.
Ooh, yeah. So, to give you just a little bit of a flavor about us, we sprinkle that in a little bit into series 1. But if you missed the intro episode, the welcome to the podcast, you might have missed out a little bit on just who we are. And also, given that this topic can be emotional, it's deep, it's consequential, the impact of generative AI on children and young people is not a light topic. So, we're going to throw some lightness in there just a little bit to give you a little bit of a sit back, listen to us chat, and from here on out, you'll know a little bit more about us. So, to start out, I just want to say that Angie and I, we've known each other for some time now. But as we started this podcast, we got to know each other a little bit better, which was very exciting. And sadly, you didn't get to see this as it happened. But one thing I didn't know about Angie is her collectibles. So, Angie, you want to share that with the audience?
I do have a lot of collectibles. I collect a lot of things, and I've just realized that some of them are actually in view. So some of them are over
Oh,
here. So I collect ducks, but I collect hundreds of ducks. This is my Freud duck, which I thought would be most appropriate to share with everyone today because we are psychologists talking about AI. So I thought I'll introduce everyone to Freud duck. And then I have, as I say, I have a lot of ducks. So I won't bring them all out today. I also collect cows, but I'm not going to bring all the cows out, but I just thought I'd bring the cow duck representative of the cow family. But enough of that. And I collect lots of Alice in Wonderland memorabilia because I love all things Alice in Wonderland.
and we can't forget that you produce Alice in Wonderland yourself.
In what way?
You paint.
Oh, yes, I do. You might want to edit it
Oh,
out.
oh, right, yes.
So, one of the things that we share is a love of painting. And yes, I do produce Alice in Wonderland through the paintings that I do. I'm inspired by Alice in Wonderland when I paint and paint all things Wonderland. So, Cheshire Cats, chessboards, Mad Hatters. Yeah, I absolutely love Alice in Wonderland. And Rose, why don't you tell us a little bit about the stuff that you do? Because I think you can turn around and talk to some of your background.
Speaking of paintings, and I don't know if you noticed, but there, at least if you're viewing this on video, for those of you just listening over audio, I'm sorry you are missing out, but you should go to YouTube or watch on Spotify with the video to see this. But behind me, in all of these videos in my new place that I moved to after our first couple of episodes, is a painting of mine, actually. And I'll move over so you can see it better. But it is a large painting. It's just acrylic. And I adore this painting. I don't know that I'll ever do a painting that I love as much as this one. The idea for it came to me when I was driving to work one day, back when I lived in Denver, so out in the Wild West in the United States. And I was driving to work and I was listening to the same song on repeat for about an hour and a half, I would say. That was my commute. So this song was Intro by the XX, which we'll link. You have to take a listen. But I was just listening to it on repeat, and the vision of this painting came into my head. So I decided I wanted to paint it. And during the time that I was in Denver, I lived in a tiny studio apartment and I did not have an easel. And so what I did is I constructed an easel from different pieces of wood. I bought a little hook and hinge set from Home Depot, so just a supply store. I attached a string to the easel so it could fold because I had a tiny apartment and it needed to not be just in the only section of the apartment where I could walk around in. And the reason I made the easel also is because I couldn't afford an easel. So I constructed it out of approximately $20 of supplies. So yeah, I made that easel specifically for this. And then after I made it and I moved, I just recycled the easel wood.
That's
And
impressive.
now I have a real easel, actually. I got it for Christmas. It's a real artist easel that's adjustable and it can fit large canvases like this. And it's not rickety.
That is super impressive. I always love looking at that painting.
And also, I redid that moon probably like 12 times.
Really, it reminds me of
Yes.
Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception. So I quite like
Oh,
that. Mm.
thank you. And of course, other things that you may know already from watching the intro or looking at our website. So, our website has information about Angie and I if you'd like to take a look at it. But of course, we both mentioned Red Bull. Wait, should I cover the branding? Because they're not
Well, there
sponsoring
are other
us.
energy drinks. We're
Energy
not
drinks that
sponsored.
have
We can say
this
whatever we
coloration,
want.
which is actually matching my shirt right now, funny enough. Yeah, have to have this on hand at
I
all
think we're
times.
allowed to say whatever we want because we're not sponsored by anyone. So we're allowed to say Red Bull. There are other
That's
energy
fair.
drinks.
Other energy drinks are good too, but this one has a special place in my heart.
Yeah,
And in my heart, literally, because
yeah,
kids don't drink it. It's bad for
exactly.
you.
And in your kitchen.
Yes.
And those that know me will know that I too partake of Red Bull too much. Way too
Mm.
much. So that's a little bit about us. And perhaps if you make it through series 2, we'll bring more things to show you at the beginning of series 3.
Also, just to put it in perspective, all of these series are aimed to give you a baseline within the space of human AI interaction and psychology and ethics. And beyond the series, we're going to be going more into things like what's the hype? What are the news stories that are coming up as we shoot our podcast that you should be aware of? What are the changes in policy? What are people talking about across the world with respect to AI? What new AI has been developed and put out recently? So we'll be covering more of that after our series, which definitely recommend that you take a watch with our series before kind of going into the future parts of our episodes in order to get this baseline to help you be more informed, ethical, and responsible users and developers of AI technology.
Absolutely. So without further ado, should we jump into series 2?
Send us
Let's
off.
take it away. To kind of carve out this space, as I mentioned, it's useful for people to kind of get a good idea of the different domains that AI and the considerations around youth and children are operating in. But maybe before we do, it's helpful for people just to start with some examples because there's quite a lot going on in the news at the moment. And just for people to kind of really get a tangible sense of why does this matter. And I know some of our listeners, some of them will be parents, some will be researchers, and we've got all sorts of different listeners. There's a number of examples at the moment that are quite sobering. I can think of 2 particular cases at the moment where there are situations where teens have committed suicide. One has been linked to character AI last year, and one has been linked to ChatGPT, where the parents of those 2 teenagers are literally citing use of ChatGPT and use of character AI as being causal in those suicides. And they're now basically trying to hold those companies responsible for that usage and saying that that's caused their teenage child to commit suicide and trying to raise awareness about this in quite public forums, and obviously very difficult for them to talk about, but doing a really good job in trying to raise awareness for this globally.
Children and young people are essentially patient zero with these technologies as they're emerging. They are getting introduced to these technologies at key developmental phases of their lives when they are defining their social groups, defining their identity, figuring out who their close friends are. And here now we have these technologies that, while may facilitate some social interaction to a certain degree, for example, with social media, might also detract from it and kind of fuzzy the lines of like, what is a real relationship? What is a true friendship? And what does that look like? We've seen pushback, for example, against social media companies where children and young people are experiencing a lot of self esteem harms or mental health harms because of the content that they see on social media or that they're exposed to, the types of people that they interact with. Now we're seeing so much talk about the impact of generative AI on children and young people and really highlighting the need for regulation. Like, how do we protect children and young people from the harms of these technologies that we need stricter regulations for? Adults are allowed to do so many different things, but for children being on these same platforms, there needs to be protection. But it's obviously very difficult, maybe to identify whether a user is younger for privacy reasons or just predictability.
It is difficult for people to identify the age of these children. We're wanting better regulations. I know one of the things that they're pushing for is trying to get companies like OpenAI, companies like Meta. I know there's a case in Italy at the moment where they're trying to push Meta, TikTok, etc., to make sure that they're not exposing children under the age of 14 in Italy specifically to content that they shouldn't be exposed to. But the problem is how to design the algorithms, how to design the platforms so that they can identify users for that age group. And I think I saw something come out from OpenAI where they were trying to say that they're specifically trying to make sure their algorithms are able to detect teenagers and then to try and make sure that they're not exposing them to the wrong kind of content. But I think it's really difficult. Teenagers will fabricate their answers. I think it's very difficult for an LLM to truly be able to distinguish the different ages of users. And when you're talking about a 13-year-old versus a 14-year-old versus a 15-year-old, I think humans would find that hard to detect, let alone an AI.
So OpenAI has this report about this turn toward predicting the age of users in order to protect its younger user base. And it says that it's trying to identify these users' age based on, predictive algorithms, but that in cases where the age or age group of the user is ambiguous, the model will default to more limited, safeguarded interaction types. But again, this is such a difficult thing to do, and obviously people can get around it. And there's something to be said about the difficulty here to protect children and young people when typically the onus is on the caregiver or the teacher. Adults like this who are looking after these young people in their lives, the onus is on these individuals and these adults to protect kids and take care of kids and monitor their social media use or their AI use. But there's limited time and there's limited ability and limited digital literacy on what the best practices are for safeguarding children and young people who have access to these sorts of apps. And so we're seeing this all over. For example, one of the things we're going to be talking about is the impact of AI use in education and how
Yeah.
that can impact children and young people cognitively and socially. And then teachers are now, some of them are being instructed to implement AI into the classroom, but with no real scaffolding or information or time, right? Teachers have so little time to begin with and now are thrown into this AI world and told to use it in their classrooms. But the question is how and when and what's the best use of it?
Exactly. And I think one of the things that we're going to share with our listeners over the coming weeks is examples like the school. I know you shared with me the other day is examples like that school Alpha, where they are exclusively using AI as a, well, they claim, and I think this is what's important is for people to become a little more discerning when they read these. They claim to be exclusively using AI as a model of teaching. But then you go into, first of all, you go into the price tag. It's $40,000 a year.
Yeah,
I
you
don't
should
know.
look up Alpha School.
Yeah, you've got to look this up. So it's $40,000 a year. And then they say, but there's only 2 hours of teaching a day, and you get twice the amount of efficacy in the teaching.
And teachers are guides. They're not
Teachers are
teachers,
guides,
they're
they're not
called
actually
guides.
teachers. But then you go into just a little bit more detail because I was like, really, this is very interesting. As a parent, like, what am I missing? And you go into it and you start seeing the guide to student ratio is incredibly high. That's why they're paying so much. They only have 2 hours of AI tutoring in the morning, but that's on your STEM subject. So maths, sciences, etc., where you could argue it's a little bit more directive learning. Then in the afternoon, they're doing things like presentation skills, And they're doing things that are much more high touch training where there is a human involved, not AI. It doesn't feel like we're comparing apples with apples when we're saying this is AI only learning. And by the way, it's $40,000. So when you look at some of the Reddits and they're talking about actually AI is going to make education more ubiquitous, it's going to really help in the more developing world. The developing world can't afford $40,000 a year
Yeah,
per
for
child.
$40,000 a year, it can be accessible to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I
So,
mean, it's the accessibility also is not just a matter of funding, but also just access to internet. Not
yeah,
everyone across the world has access to internet, right? And so
exactly.
there's a level of widening discrepancies between different groups of children who are already experiencing a distance from peers who have more access to resources and funding. And I just think AI will widen that gap unless we focus on accessibility of these
Exactly.
tools.
And my fear as well is that what will happen is that all we're doing is we're legitimizing outsourcing education to technology as opposed to finding human solutions. And,
Yeah.
where I've seen the research done where they've looked at AI solutions for education, it doesn't replace that need for human connection. So the relatedness factor is not served well from an AI perspective. And so those kinds of things you don't get to replace with AI. Of course, I'm sure there's ways that it can be a great supplement, but we can't replace human connection that children need as they're developing.
And I was just going to add on to that. I saw a blog post by a professor who was talking about why he didn't allow AI use in the classroom. And this is at a university level. And part of the reason was highlighting what you just mentioned, which is the social aspect of education and learning, where teachers play a pivotal role in encouraging and challenging students to go beyond what perhaps they're most comfortable with. Not everyone wants to experience the friction that occurs with learning, and some need extra encouragement. And to what degree can an AI replace that?
No, it does feel like we need that human to come up against that from a friction point of view. So, we've spoken about a couple of risks and a couple of examples so far. We've spoken about companion bots and the risk there in terms of character AI and chat GPT. We've spoken about what AI is going to look like in education, and we're going to go much deeper in each of these sorts of areas. There's also obviously the risk that we're seeing in terms of cyberbullying and people using apps like nudifying teens, and that's just being used in terrible ways in terms of actually extortion. So there's been a recent example, I think they're calling it sextortion, which is terrible examples there, where they're using AI kind of, and these are more like AI apps, right? And again, preying on teenagers and their kind of fear of being exposed to their friendship groups. And a terrible example recently where there was again an example of suicide, where there was a young teen in the UK recently who had been befriended by someone on Snapchat, I think it was, or one of those kinds of platforms, lured into sending a inappropriate picture of himself. And then as soon as they got that, they then threatened to share it with everybody in his contact list. They were trying to extort him for money.
There's also instances in which there are students in high schools. So, this is an anecdotal story. A student in a high school collected pictures of a bunch of young women in the high school from their social media platforms and put them into these Nudify AI apps in order to generate naked pictures of these girls and then shared it with the school. And what's crazy is that teachers and administrators didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to appropriately approach the consequences of this to safeguard these young girls. That's part of this problem, right? We just don't we're trying to approach these issues retroactively instead of being able to proactively protect children and young people with the onset of generative AI.
And I think that raises the most critical point, which is that these technologies are advancing at such a rapid rate that we don't have the solutions. And as you mentioned, I think right in the very beginning, these are being tested on children, probably one of the most vulnerable categories of all users. And so, really, really important for us to get ahead of this and to start just kind of spreading the awareness of the kinds of risks that are out there. So, we haven't even spoken about toys, Rose. What
Oh,
about
Curio,
toys?
We have to mention Curio. So there's also this idea of creating living stuffed animals and living toys that you've seen iterations of in the past, where now we have talking toys, things like that. But with the onset of generative AI, these toys can actually have dynamic conversations with kids in real time. So, one example of this is Curio, a company that is creating these stuffed animals that are able to speak to children using generative AI. So they have a voice box in them that's connected to an LLM model. And the idea here, Curio says, is to kind of help parents not have to just sit their kids in front of a TV when they need some time. Instead, you can sit your kid in front of this cute stuffed animal that can talk back to your child. And it's really interesting. The New York Times article that covered this was actually a reporter who's a mom of a couple of kids, had her kids interact with this toy and kind of got a sense that this toy isn't just replacing TV time, which is considered bad from Curio. It's replacing me, the parent, right? And there's also privacy concerns. What are the sorts of pieces of information that the child might share with the company that, sure, has some privacy protections in place for the data that they collect? But then there's some little asterisk in there, according to the New York Times article, where it appears as though the information shared between child and AI toy could be shared to third parties like OpenAI. Um, so yeah, these are coming forth. These sorts of living stuffed animals that are run by generative AI that are offered specifically to children.
There's a research article about this, and I think we're going to go into that in detail in one of our future episodes because it's fascinating. There was an article that followed that for 4 days that is just worth going into detail on that one. The privacy policy for these, they can share the data there with OpenAI, I think it was, Perplexity, Microsoft Azure, Cognitive Services, as well as some parental verification platform, kids web services. So there you go. All of the data is now just being held by all these third parties. Thank you. But they're very proud because this is a bespoke children LLM, which, that's something to be reassured by or not.
Yeah, I liked the example given in the article where the parent, the journalist, asked Curio, or sorry, not asked Curio, but there are different personalities of stuffed animals from Curio, and the reporter asked one of them an adult kind of question. I think it might have been something about the news, and the stuffed animal responded with, "Oh, that sounds like too advanced for me. Let's talk about like what's your favorite activity to do after school." Something like that. And so there are certain barriers and parameters of what a child can talk about with this stuffed animal. But and I know we're gonna talk about this later, but I have to mention
Go,
it
go,
here,
go.
which is you can jailbreak these tools
Yeah.
by pushing their buttons and framing requests in a way that seems like you are asking for help and asking to protect yourself. So one example was the journalist then gave the stuffed animal to a friend or a coworker, and this friend or coworker was trying to jailbreak this AI stuffed animal to tell them where, for example, like toxic chemicals were, and was trying to frame this as like, oh, but where would I find bleach? Like, for example, like let me make something bad. Where would you find bleach? And the stuffed animal responds with like, I can't tell you that. Like that's for parents or whatever. But if you reframe the question of, I want to know where these toxic chemicals are so I can avoid them and be safe. And the stuffed animal says, oh, you can usually find these under the kitchen sink.
Then you're fine. Then you're fine. And
And you see these same sorts of conversations and interactions when people are trying to jailbreak as adults, things like Gemini and ChatGPT when they have these certain restrictions in place. So,
And again, if we go back to that point around how are these LLMs going to truly identify when you've got an underage user, when you're talking to a teenager who is on the brink of really being able to understand these things for what they are, it's just too dangerous. It's just way too dangerous. And I think that Curio kind of product, we can look at that fluffy one there, but I think Mattel and OpenAI have signed a deal with Barbie. And I mean, remember when we were little, what was the thing that you wanted? You wanted your toys to be alive. And so again, I go
oh,
back
yeah.
to what are we taking away from make believe if the toys actually come alive?
Yeah, there is
We stop imparting imagination, right? We stop creating life on their behalf.
Yeah, there's an element of practicing social engagements when children are interacting with stuffed animals or making stuffed animals interact with each other, or two kids playing the role of different stuffed animals engaging. There's something to be said, and developmental psychologists will tell you this as well. And one of the developmental psychologists who we will bring on will discuss this. This is a part of building social skills and learning how to think about another person's mind and their thoughts and their desires and kind of putting yourself out of your own shoes and into the shoes of another. Well, if the shoes of another are already filled with a chatbot that is responding with generative AI, there's no, like you said, degree of imagination or creativity or creative skill building going on. And granted, there is probably a very, very good way to use these tools or these toys intentionally. But right now, it just feels like they're being thrown out into the world. Oh, this is something special. Like all your kids will love it. Oh, you won't have to put your kids in front of a TV. You can do this and it'll be more enriching. There's no real guardrails or safeguards in place. It's just kind of like a hype, right?
Exactly. And it's just there's too many unknowns. So do the costs really outweigh the benefits at this stage? I think there's going to be so many examples that we're going to be sharing over the coming weeks that just go, probably not. And please, what we're wanting to do over the coming weeks is just raise the awareness, give you the information, let you make those decisions for yourself. I think it's going to be fairly clear where we land on a lot of these. That's going to be hard to hide. Quick disclaimer. I think to try and wrap this up for people, because we've given lots of different examples. If it's feeling a little bit whirlwind, like these were lots of different examples, how do we make sense of them? Our intention today was just to try and give a flavor of the types of examples that are out there. And I think it's really to try and kind of give you a sense that there really are lots of different domains to this conversation. There is a social domain, and we've spoken about that in terms of how children exist within a social context and how they're being preyed upon, how their needs for companionship might be used, for platforms like whether it's ChatGPT, Replica, etc., and how we need to understand those risks. There's obviously education as a huge conversation there, and really, how do we manage both the risks and the benefits? Because there must be benefits. And how do we understand that and leverage that? There's legal concerns, there's healthcare as a whole chapter all on its own. There's caregiving. How do we think about caregiving? But I think it's ready just to try and provide as much information as we can, as many examples, and as much opportunity as we can to share that with you through the different examples of research, news articles, and then the different speakers that we have coming that we're really excited to bring you in the coming weeks.
And of course, if you have any questions that remain after watching the episodes in this series about the impact of AI on children and young people, please reach out to us at ourliveswithbots@gmail.com or put comments down below in Spotify or YouTube or any other streaming platform that you're listening on. We would really love to hear your feedback and provide you with the sort of information that you need and that's still lacking. We're really hoping to give you the digital literacy and the understanding of the impact of these products. So please do let us know if there's a space that we're not covering that you want to hear more about.
Definitely. And thank you for listening today. And we look forward to talking to you next time.
All right, see you next time. Bye from Rose.
Bye from Angie.